Okay, so today we're going to be talking about breaking the cycle of poverty. And our question is a rather perplexing one. One that has had different answers depending on what part of history you ask this question. Who has the responsibility? So let's jump back a little bit. How do we solve the problem of poverty? If poverty is something that we've always experienced as part of the human condition. In regards to people in the Americas, poverty dates back to the first peoples coming here. But in regards to Europeans moving to the Americas, poverty dates back to the first settlements even. For example, there was a terrible winter in Jamestown known as the Starving Time, where most of the population of Jamestown died. In fact, more people were dying in Jamestown than were being born or were coming in. And more shipments of settlers kept continuously coming to the settlement until it was finally successful. It's a rather dark and depressing situation to think about, that more people literally were dying than were coming in or being born. Now, throughout the 20th century, of course, we talked greatly about the Great Depression, and that was the time in American history that we've experienced the most widespread suffering and poverty. But as I said, poverty has always been part of the American condition and really part of the human condition. So how do we combat this as a society? Well, during the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt proposed several bold measures to begin to provide a safety net for our citizens. One of these was the Social Security Act, perhaps one of the longest lasting programs created by the New Deal. And this created a pension fund for retired people over the age of 65 and offered government aid to poor people. For the very first time, the federal government took a social responsibility for those in need. Now, after the Second World War, we also talked about the golden age, the 1950s, the post-war prosperity, and sadly that time was very short-lived. We'll move on. Lyndon Johnson was vice president to John F. Kennedy, and he hoped to continue a lot of Kennedy's programs, particularly a national assault on poverty. He called it the War on Poverty. During this time, his administration expanded education, training, and financial aid to the poor. He called it the Equal Opportunity Act. And remember, like our discussion on opportunity versus outcome, the idea was to give everyone an equal chance to succeed in life. And a huge part of that has been education. In fact, it's one of the more expensive measures of his war on poverty, and one that still continues today. I do consider myself to be involved in the war on poverty. I consider you to be involved in this war on poverty. And we do see some measurable effects of this. People living below the poverty line prior to Johnson, roughly 20% of our population. And then by 1973, this was down to 11%. Now, you could say there were other factors involved, and there certainly were. But this war on poverty was having measurable results. Now, throughout the 1980s, economic hard times reappeared. The poverty rate began to rise once more. In fact, by the turn of the century, 32.3 million Americans still live below the poverty line. And the number, meaning the income level that defines poverty, has changed as inflation has affected the value of our money. Yet what it means is that people cannot provide a basic standard of living without assistance. That's how our government defines poverty currently. And at this time, it was defined by an annual household income of $17,029 a year or less for a family of four. And that was as of 1999. So the number, I'm sure, has changed slightly, but you get the picture. And so with Americans in poverty, one of the biggest issues is underemployment. And so this has been one of the concerns with the recovery from our recession in 2008. Yes, jobs have come back, but the concern is most of the jobs coming back do not pay a sufficient income to provide a decent standard of living, like you saw in the little infographic at the beginning. Many Americans who live in poverty are working, are employed, are doing the very best they can. And these people are known as the working poor. And that means that they do work. They do work full time. Many pundits and politicians like to place the blames of economic troubles facing our country on the poor, and that's just simply not accurate. Because the working poor make up a large percentage of that 32.3 million. Because they hold low-wage jobs with few benefits, and these jobs do not offer health insurance. Like we talked about with health care, when the ACA required that employers provide health insurance for their full-time workers, employers just cut down their workers to part-time. Now, children. Again, we define 18 and under as children, so you are legally a child. Account for a large share of our poor. In fact, the poverty rate among children in the United States is the highest of any Western industrialized nation. So I want you to think carefully about that before you say America's the greatest. Our childhood poverty rate is almost equivalent to some third world countries. In fact, there are pockets of this nation that could be considered third world countries with the rates of poverty that we experience in certain parts. And it is the highest of any, quote, Western industrialized nation. Homelessness. In the 1980s, cuts in welfare and food stamps as part of Reaganomics brought the attention of homelessness to the nation. On a given night in October, roughly 444,000 people in 346,000 households experience homelessness. If you don't believe it, drive up Avery Creek Road in Brevard any given night of the week. There's a number of free camping spots in Pisgah, and I do frequent those because I spend a lot of time riding the trails out there. I mean, several times a week. I was there yesterday evening. Right up the road, yesterday evening, I saw homeless people setting up camp for the night because they allow free camping in those places. Every time I'm there, I'm confronted with our local homeless community. We have 2 homeless shelters, one in Henderson, one in Transylvania. My wife and I are involved with the one in Transylvania. We volunteer there. We contribute a small amount there. I encourage you to get involved because our homeless community, well, translates to roughly 6.3% of the population. It means out of every 100 people in our county, at least 6 are going to be homeless. And you see them. You may not notice it. They look just like us. Often, I spend a lot of time at the library. I love Brevard's little library. And homeless people will come in there to check their email and to get on social media and to connect and, look for jobs and look for work. Many of these people do hold jobs. In fact, when I ride through that same road during the day, most of those tents are empty. Most of the parking spots are vacated. Why? Because those people are working. It's not like they're bums. It's not like they're drug addicts. It's not like the narrative that is so often repeated. It's just that simply these people cannot earn enough money to provide for housing. And so they're allowed to stay up to 14 days at a time in any one of these locations. There's enough locations around the county where they can hop, and they do. Don't believe me? Drive up Courthouse Creek. It's one of those popular tourist spots. It's also a popular spot for homeless people to stay for a period of time. So, a lack of housing is symptomatic of larger problems. Yes, unemployment, which hovers around 7%. Also low-wage jobs. The high cost of housing, which you did the little poverty simulation last year. You had fun with it like silly. Oh, I don't want to feed my kid or whatever. But think of those things if they were real. And think of the high cost of living. Do the math sometime. Could you make it if you had to pay $450 a month for rent? Not to mention if you had a child. In some cases, homeless people find themselves in that situation because of personal problems, such as substance abuse, often associated with mental illness. And I guess what can we do? What can we as a society do? If we just continue to demonize, ignore, and blame these people for the woes that affect our country, then nothing will ever change. Because the poor often make a convenient scapegoat for politicians who like to place the ills of society on those who have little. Why? Because they can't advocate for themselves, not to the degree of corporations. So what are some possible causes of poverty? We really do want the best for you here. We really do. And I hope you understand that's why we're so hard on you. And your parents as well. Why are they so hard on you? Because they want the best for you. Because they want you to be successful. Because I would wager many of your parents understand this in a pretty real way, like mine. I grew up in poverty, and I'm sure many of you have as well. What are some possible causes for these situations? Number one, it just may be a lack of marketable skills. I'm sure your parents are some of the hardest working people you know, but maybe they just don't have a skill set or a talent that can translate to a job that pays more than $20 an hour. Those jobs are hard to come by, especially when you consider jobs that offer benefits and retirement, health care, etc. And those jobs often require years of training and education. An education that's often not available or accessible to those who are already in poverty. My wife also grew up in poverty, and she went on to college, and she did well. She went on to grad school. I'm so proud of her. We've been paying for her education for the past 10 years, and it's going to take us a couple more. She says all the time, man, I wish I'd had this early college program. You guys have an amazing opportunity here. Half your college is paid for. Now, what do those in poverty need? What was it about the war on poverty that made it so successful in a measurable way? Well, partly, if people can't access the skills necessary to lift them out of poverty, how can we provide them with the training to acquire these skills? Now also, you saw at the title of the lesson, the issue is breaking the cycle of poverty. And that's the purpose of this school. That's actually why this school exists, to break the cycle of poverty. Read about New School's mission statement sometime. It's there. I read the literature on it before I applied here. That's it, is to break the cycle of poverty. Well, what does a cycle of poverty mean? That means that if you grow up in a family in poverty, you are statistically likely to wind up in the same situation. The odds are actually stacked against you. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean you have no free will? Well, obviously you have free will. However, your life's conditions, behavioral specialists call this an environmental factor in your decisions. An environmental factor that affects your life choices. And sadly, you are statistically likely to wind up in a similar situation as your parents. How do we break that cycle? Well, part of this can be education, and that's why I'm here. We need training not just in marketable skills, but also in work habits, deadlines, timeliness, punctuality. Any of these ringing a bell? Professionalism. Yeah, why don't we let you use foul language in class? Because it's not professional. I'm not going to get into the morality of foul language. That's a different subject. It's not professional. So we don't use that. We don't act that way. Why do we have dress codes here? Because it's not professional to dress inappropriately. Simply not. We need to model the work environment to teach you those skills. Why? Well, because we believe in you. Because we want you to rise out of that situation as well. Another problem can be limited access to child care. You see, if life happens, and it does, thankfully with ACA, the rate of teen pregnancy has gone down, thanks in large part due to a better availability of contraceptives. Yet, life does happen sometimes. And at that time, when, usually mothers wind up with the custody of the child in those types of situations. And usually in the case of teen pregnancy, the burden often falls on the grandparents as well. But we've done studies on mothers who receive welfare. And I showed you the results of one of those at the beginning of this lesson. We found that mothers receiving welfare, single mothers, can make a living by combining paid work with outside support from welfare and food stamps. But you saw that as the income climbs, the benefits go down. Because let's suppose that, and right now someone working minimum wage with a child does still qualify for federal aid. But let's assume that person begins to make more money. Well, you already saw what happens. And I quote, "If she cannot find free child care and has to pay the going rate, her standard of living would decline by 20%, as you saw previously." Now, in 1996, a federal welfare law was passed, which did provide funding for child daycare. Though, as you saw, as the income goes up, those benefits decline. And so where I hedged my bets was on the U.S. public education system. Yet many argue that this has not provided the tools necessary to climb out of poverty. Because you see, and I'm not blaming the schools for this, but let me quote a writer on education, Ann Lewis. And I quote, "3/4 of all welfare or food stamp recipients perform at the lowest levels of literacy." Literacy meaning the ability to read, write, and speak articulately. And unfortunately, if you don't have those basic skills, then it is going to be very difficult for you to succeed in the working world. Yes, you could probably find a very low-skilled job if your literacy skills are low, yet you're not going to be able to find a high-paying job if you do not have those basic and fundamental skills. And so that's why embedded in your education is literacy training. Why do we write papers? It's one of the big reasons. Why do we do public speaking assignments? Well, that's it. Because you see, low levels of literacy generally lead to low employment rates and low wages. We also have to understand that poverty is more prevalent among minorities. I wanted to use the latest census to give you some of today's numbers. 27.4% of African Americans live in poverty. 26.6% of Hispanic Americans, while only 9.9% of non-Hispanic whites, and a slightly higher number for Asian Americans. And so poverty does tend to be more prevalent among minorities.
Doesn't seem fair. Life just be that way, I guess. If you walk walk through the garden, you better watch your back.
I come from a country that is now utterly schizophrenic when it comes to its society, its economy, its politics. There are definitely two Americas. I live on one block in Baltimore that is part of the viable America, the America that's connected to its own economy, where there's a plausible future for the people born into it. About 20 blocks away is another America entirely. It's astonishing how little we have to do with each other, and yet we live in such proximity. There's no barbed wire around West Baltimore or around East Baltimore or around Pimlico, the areas that are in my city that have been utterly divorced from the American experience that I know. But there might as well be. If you're white and you're killed 3 blocks from the Hopkins campus, all the detectives in Baltimore are going to be called in to do everything possible to solve that murder. On the other hand, if you're an 18-year-old kid shot to death in the 2400 block of Edmondson Avenue, where somebody is shot to death once a month, whether they need it or not, you're going to get one detective. He's going to shake the case for a couple of days. That really speaks to these sort of two cities living side by side, where the stakes have been made, very different.
Now, critics of welfare argue that providing financial aid to the poor gives them little incentive to better their lives and thus creates a culture of poverty in what has been called the welfare state. And so in 1996, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act was passed. In short, it's called the Welfare to Work Program. The idea with this was to cut welfare spending by $55 billion over 6 years, meaning a decline in the level of benefits that could be offered, meaning fewer people on welfare. It also placed a 5-year limit on welfare payments, and benefits would be cut to recipients who had not found a job in 2 years. Again, I encourage you to go volunteer your time at the homeless shelter. You're required to do community service hours anyway. I think it would be enlightening. As you talk to people who stay there, it's temporary for most families. It always is, because they stay there for a few months and then eventually they'll find something more sustainable. But it's meant to be a stepping stone into self-sufficiency. Those people work. They go to jobs. In fact, when I volunteer there, the place is pretty empty during the work hours, and then we're mainly watching as they come back in to make dinner for their families and so forth.
The new bill restores America's basic bargain of providing opportunity and demanding in return responsibility. It provides $14 billion for child care, $4 billion more than the present law does. It is good because without the assurance of child care, it's all but impossible for a mother with young children to go to work. It requires states to maintain their own spending on welfare reform and gives them powerful performance incentives to place more people on welfare in jobs. It gives states the capacity to create jobs by taking money now used for welfare checks and giving it to employers as subsidies, as incentives to hire people.
Now, supporters of this program claimed that this was going to transform a system from one that fosters dependence to one that encourages self-reliance. The idea was that some people need financial assistance, but if we as a society can help people move to self-sufficiency, well, then we've done our job. Opponents of this accuse the federal government of turning its back on the poor, especially children. So welfare to work is a great idea in theory. But yet, what about children that are unable to work? And if their families lose those benefits, what happens to those children? Now, the law's success depended on putting recipients of welfare to work. And not only did it offer that negative incentive of get a job in 2 years or you lose your benefits, but it also provided incentives for businesses to hire recipients of welfare. For one, businesses could receive tax credits for hiring recipients of welfare. And so that meant that the business could ensure that it would bring in more money to offset the possible cost of employing someone who may or may not be ready for that job. And also, wage subsidies. Businesses were incentivized to hire recipients of welfare because the federal government actually promised to pay a portion of their wages. And then finally, the establishment of enterprise zones. And these would provide tax breaks to companies that would locate in economically depressed areas. So one thing that we saw with white flight was that as the wealthier, affluent people were moving out of cities, like the man you were just hearing, we have these segregated neighborhoods, often by race, but more importantly by class, that poor people were living in these economically depressed areas. And so because of that, no businesses wanted to go there, because they're not going to make as much money as they would if they catered to these wealthier, more affluent areas. You're not going to find a Starbucks in South Baltimore. You're not going to find many, quote, affluent businesses there. And you're not going to find a lot of great employers. Factories aren't going to locate in these areas. Yet, the part of welfare to work was that if companies would move to those areas, then the government would actually give them tax breaks, incentivize employers to move to low-income neighborhoods to provide jobs. Now, George W. Bush called for $8 billion to help religious and other volunteer organizations assume more responsibility for the needy. It has always been the conservative stance that it is not the responsibility of the government to assume responsibility for the social welfare of its people. The liberal stance has been that government can be a positive agent for change and a positive agent for progress, and that the government should assume a social responsibility. So that's basically liberal economics in a nutshell. Conservative economics is it's simply not the government's job. You know, think of Calvin Coolidge when Mississippi flooded, Katrina-style hurricane there. He said, it's not our job. The government sent no aid, period. And so he supported time limits on welfare benefits and called for able-bodied welfare recipients to get jobs, to attend school, or to train for work. And so President George W. Bush said, basically pass the buck. Said, welfare recipients, you need to go improve your situation, and we're going to reduce your benefits. And here's a quote from Obama. I think it's important when it comes to dealing with issues of poverty for us to guard against cynicism and not by the idea that the poor will always be with us and there's nothing we can do, because there's a lot that we can do. Now, President Obama says that overcoming poverty requires both strong families and a strong economy. One of his first acts as president was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. This included broad investments to alleviate poverty, which were made worse by the economic crisis. $20 billion in increase for food stamps and WIC, $2 billion in new neighborhood stabilization funds, $1.5 billion for homelessness prevention. And this was called the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And for years, you saw the construction on 26 between Asheville and here. That was funded by this, jobs creation programs to rebuild crumbling infrastructure and to provide opportunities for those who have so little.
Stocks plummet.
Consumer confidence has reached an all-time low.
The unemployment rate surged to 7.6% in January. It's roughly the population of Las Vegas.
And if there's anyone out there who still doesn't believe this constitutes a full-blown crisis, I suggest speaking to one of the millions of Americans whose lives have been turned upside down because they don't know where their next paycheck is coming from.
I'm currently unemployed. I was a sales rep in the yarn industry, and my husband's studying to be a registered nurse. I can't even begin to imagine a year from now, if things stay the way they are, where we'll be. We've already sold assets. We're in the process of looking at what else can we eliminate. I sell my plasma twice a week to try to help balance our budget. The future for our family is bleak if we don't get some type of assistance.
We are facing the worst economic challenge we've had since the 1930s. We have already lost 2 million jobs almost over the last 4 months. We need something that's really going to reach all the different sectors of the economy, to do it soon and do it in a sustained way.
So we went to work to try to create an economic recovery package.
Many families have fallen victim during this economic recession through no fault of their own.
We will extend benefits to those people who are temporarily unemployed.
Help being able to keep their health care, help being able to get retraining or be able to put food on the table.
We need to assist those families. They turn around and spend these dollars in the economy, help restore demand, and recreate jobs.
And then we're going to invest in infrastructure programs.
When we talk about infrastructure, we're talking about construction for road projects.
The bridges, the water systems, the sewer systems, the things that every great economic power has to do anyway.
As we invest in infrastructure, we'll employ a lot of contractors, construction, manufacturing, but they'll have that income and they'll put it back into the economy. It will affect our retail sector, our tourism sector, education sector.
This stimulus package also gives our country a unique opportunity to move towards energy independence.
We want to make sure that we develop the type of energy grid in this country that will allow us to utilize wind energy and solar energy so that we can be less dependent upon imported foreign oil.
Green jobs is such an important part of this package because we know those jobs will stay here. When you put a solar panel on a house in Atlanta, Georgia, or San Francisco, that job stays here.
Not only is that an investment right now in jobs, but in the long run that'll pay off benefits in terms of savings and energy costs over many, many, many years.
This package not only will save or create up to 4 million jobs, it also delivers on President Obama's promise to put more money in the pockets of the middle class and the working poor through tax cuts.
95% of Americans will receive a tax benefit, a relief of taxes.
It's about tax fairness, and it reduces the taxes on our working families, puts money into our working families' pockets, which they will then spend to help create jobs in our economy.
This tax credit provision provides a tax credit for home buyers.
For those that are buying their home for the first time, it will stimulate the markets, but also will help young families get into homes and become an owner of a home, which I think is a huge plus. When you're doing something this big, it's very important to insist on accountability. The public demanded accountability, transparency, and knowing what results they get with the tax dollars they gave us. Those that receive the money, state governments and many others, I want quarterly reports. They've got to tell us, we got the money, here's what we did with the money, and here's how many jobs we created.
We're going to track, every dollar that goes through.
All this is directly targeted to ensuring that the payout on these programs, at least 78% of it will be paid out in the first 18 months of the program.
This recovery package is a terrific first step towards restoring the long-term health of our economy.
We did what we could to try to create a recovery package that will lift this country and give people some hope once again.
It's a new approach focused on America, on the American people, and on putting people back to work.
I think the focus is changing. And I think that people in my situation are looking at this as a step in the right direction.
And I'd like to continue exploring this Reinvestment Act. You see, it increased funding for community services block by $1 billion. It was aimed at helping poor families, making their homes more energy efficient by increasing funding into green or renewable energy resources. Also provided more funding for the workforce investment system. Okay, and so the workforce investment system was Coach Mack's job. Now it's Coach Frady's job. His job is to help ensure your success. That's almost half of what he does here on a daily basis. Also provides job training, summer jobs for young people, etc. And then finally, the Workforce Investment Act provided many summer jobs, but then additionally boosts to Social Security and supplemental security income beneficiaries, boosts for temporary assistance for needy families, called TANF, and then finally tax breaks to working families through the Make Work Pay and child tax credits. And these changes were created to reduce the marriage penalty and to provide a larger credit for families with 3 or more children. We're excited. So, yeah.